Welcome everyone to the workshop about, neural networks for images and audio. We understand this is a difficult workshop. It's not right after lunch, but it's during lunch, so I hope we'll acquire more people while we go. Secondly, we have a very limited time only, so we start here right on time. This is a workshop that is pretty much stuffed. First with audio, that's going to be the first half of the workshop, and then with images. We'll have a slight difference in style in those two workshops. Carlo will start with audio, and I think he will do a more conservative approach by explaining how to do things. And I'll do the second part. By the way, my name is Markus van Almsick. I'll talk about images, and I won't talk so much about how you do image processing with neural networks in Mathematica, because we have done this before, so it would start to get boring. I'll rather explain why certain things work well and why other things don't work well, and what may be the solution in the future. So it's going to be a more disruptive talk with good and bad stuff in there, and we'll see how it works. This is a kind of a test run. All right, here's your floor.
Hello everyone, I'm Carlo, and I work on audio analysis and processing, and a little bit of neural networks and machine learning. And today I will talk about the connection between neural networks and audio signals. The main topics I'm going to be talking about is first starting how to build a very simple audio classifier. It will be a small network on a toy dataset, but the techniques that you can use are definitely extensible to bigger problems. Then a simple example of audio event detection, and then another example of transfer learning. So let's start with the audio classifier. All we need to start is labeled data and a network. As for labeled data, we will use the spoken digit commands dataset, which is in our resource system. It is essentially the equivalent of MNIST. It's a collection of recordings of people speaking the digits from 0 to 9. And it's labeled both with the number, the digit that is spoken, and the identity of the person. For this specific classifier, we will completely ignore the identity of the person. We will focus on what is spoken. So the idea is to classify the digits independently on who the speaker is. So this is a random sample of the dataset. Let's see if audio works properly.
3.
1.
2.
As you can see, there is a lot
3.
of variety in recording methods. People have contributed. This was an open source project, so random people have contributed to it. So bad microphone, noisy rooms, these are all problems that you might encounter in the dataset. Okay, so how do we inject audio into a neural network? Well, the Wolfram language provides the net encoders, which are wonderful things that convert more complex data structures into tensors of numbers, which is the format that neural networks are usually very happy with. And we provide a reasonably complete collection of encoders, different types of encoders for audio. In this specific example, I will use the audio MFCC encoder with a fixed size. So this will take an audio signal and produce a matrix that's 50 by 32 in this specific case. And this is what that kind of data would look like. So now, I mentioned I am using the MFCC encoder. Now, what does that mean? Well, so let's talk quickly about audio encoders. As I was saying, we provide different types of encoders that perform different operations on the audio data. Let's start with the audio encoder. The most simple one, it just grabs the sample values of the signal and puts that into a n by 1 matrix. So it's just the flat data that is then passed to the neural net. Of course, this is not an ideal representation. First, it can be huge given sample rates of audio and the fact that it is intrinsically variable length. Second, we cannot really exploit all of the things that we might have learned in image processing, because this is one-dimensional data rather than two-dimensional data. So it's convenient to have in some situations. It's definitely not what we're looking for right now. Another encoder is the short-time Fourier transform. This partitions the signal and computes a Fourier transform on each of the partitions. So you get a two-dimensional signal that intrinsically contains both time and frequency information. And this is, you can reconstruct perfectly a signal if you have the full short-time Fourier transform. Instead, if you square all of these components and discard the reflected part of the Fourier transforms, the signal is not invertible anymore, but the amount of data that you're dealing with is still, it is much smaller. Another variation on the spectrogram is the MEL spectrogram. The idea is pretty simple. We take this time frequency information and we filter the frequency information with a nonlinear scale so that we kind of mimic human perception. We don't perceive pitch in a linear scale. We perceive pitch in a kind of a logarithmic fashion. So this audio MEL spectrogram does a similar operation. And the side effect of this is that the dimensionality of the output is reduced even more. With the MFCC, we take the MEL spectrum and do an additional transformation, specifically the discrete cosine transform, and discard some of the higher order components. And this reduces the dimensionality of the input further. And this is the result of a lot of classical signal processing research. This is one of the main features that was used in classical signal processing operations before neural networks were a big thing, let's say. And the main characteristic is that it preserves a lot of information about what is spoken, again, as I said, while reducing the amount of data that you will need to analyze. So, as I was saying before, this is the net encoder that we chose for our network. By the way, incidentally, the net encoders that we provide with the language have a lot of more functionality. One very important one is the data augmentation. So if you have a small data set, you want, like if you are analyzing images during training, you will randomly crop and rotate those images to artificially augment the data points that you have to train. The data augmentation in the audio net encoders allows you to do exactly the same thing. And there are some augmentation that are more simple, like time shifting, and some that are more problem specific, like the vocal tract line perturbation is something that applies specifically to speech signals. Anyways, I will not go into details because we have limited time. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that these net encoders are implemented in a very efficient way, and this is why you should use these rather than system functions to inject data into a neural network. So, on the other side of our network, we need something that converts the tensor that the network produces, the tensor of probabilities that the network produces into a class label, and this is what the net decoder does. So, let's look at this. This is a vector of probabilities, and this will just output the label, which is taken from this list that was given as input of the decoder, that correspond to the most probable class for that specific tensor of probabilities. So, what are we doing for our network? Let's remember that we have an encoder that produces a fixed size matrix. So what happens here is simply flattening our matrix into a single vector. And then this is a simple multi-layer perceptron, which is made up of fully connected layers, which are matrix multiplications that are then passed through a nonlinearity. This is like essentially the most basic neural network that you could imagine. Even though it is extremely simple, and as you can imagine, fast to train, this took just 6 seconds, I think, yes. The results are still pretty impressive. Well, let's see if my machine actually wants to scroll down. Here we go. It took about 6 seconds with a throughput of about 30,000 examples per second. We still get an accuracy of 80%. The only knowledge that we injected into this problem was the fact that we computed the MFCC features. And this is why we, even with such a simple network, we can get such a high accuracy. Of course, we can do better by using a more complicated network. I was mentioning before that the encoder that we use produced fixed sign matrices, but audio data is inherently of variable length. The dataset that we're using is inherently of variable length. Just because it might take more time to say a digit than another, or you might have forgotten to press the stop button or something like that. So let's enable this variable length nature of audio by specifying target length goes to all in the net encoder. And as you can see, this produces an encoder where the matrix size, the first dimension of the matrix, is unspecified. So if we try to use the same network, we would get a dramatic error message because our multi-layer perceptron accepts something with a fixed size. So we need to figure out something else. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with neural networks in general, but in image processing, one typical architecture uses convolutional layers, which perform convolutions on images. Now, if you, out of the box, convolution layer does not work on varying dimension. In the Wolfram language, to allow convolution layer to operate on data of varying dimensions, the interleaving options needs to be specified so that the channel dimension gets pushed as the last one, and the first dimension is the one that we allow to vary. So this is, again, a pretty simple network. It has 2 convolution layers followed by a nonlinearity. And after that, the result is aggregated on the time dimension. Let's remember that is the only varying one. So by doing this aggregation, we reduce the output to a fixed size tensor and then classified with a fully connected layer. Again, pretty straightforward network. I will not run this example on my machine just because we don't have that amount of time. But I will show you the result. On a GPU machine, this took 20 seconds, so not very much. And without that much effort, we improved the accuracy from about 80% to slightly more than 90%. So, is this the best that we can do using a simple network on a simple dataset? Well, not necessarily. So, let's introduce a new concept that is not used as much in image processing. Let's use something that is that was conceived specifically for sequence processing, not necessarily audio. This is something that is very popular in, for example, NLP and stuff like that. You could also use something like this on images if you set up your problem in an appropriate way, of course. So we are basing our network on the gated recurrent layer. So what are recurrent layers? The idea is pretty simple. We have a single set of weights that are then applied to 2 inputs. One is the input from the data, and one is the state of the layer at that time. So we apply these weights at step number 1. I'm not sure exactly what this is. Produce an output, an internal state, and feed those values to the next step, which will receive, again, the internal state of the previous time step and the data at that specific time step. So we can process sequences of arbitrary length with a very small number of parameters. And this keeps track of both short and long-term dependencies. So there are several layers that are recurrent, that perform the same kind of operation, just with a different internal graph for the operations that are performed. The ones that we have in the language are basic recurrent layer, gated recurrent layer, and long short-term memory layer. And of course, you can also define your own using the netfold operator to create your own custom recurrent layer. As I was saying, this holds a bunch of trainable parameters, and this is an example of what processing a sequence would mean. At each step, as I said, you get information both from the input data at time step n and from the internal state at time step n-1. Okay, so we have our simple network created using a stack of recurrent layers. Actually, let's look at that again. And then we just isolate the state, the last internal state of this network. And then we apply a multi-layer perceptron to this internal state to produce a single classification. So we start with a variable length sequence, process it, take the last step of it, and then classify it in one of our 10 classes. This training is actually faster on a CPU than the convolutional one that we were looking at before. We get a comparable accuracy to the convolution one with a smaller net. And one way to improve the result that we had right now is to add some regularization to the training. And we will do that in the form of adding dropout. For recurrent layers, the best way to apply dropout in the training process is to specify the dropout option inside the definition of gated recurrent layer. Let's look at a result again. We get immediately an improved accuracy, almost 94%. And you might ask, will we get a better result if we specify a more complicated net? Well, in this case, that might not be the case just because of how the data set was collected, because again, it was an open source data set that was contributed by the public. So a lot of, well, some of the data at least is badly recorded or mislabeled. This was one example. And by the way, with classifier measurement, we can quickly access and get information on what were problematic examples.
8.
Well,
9.
These. Okay, this one was silent, for example. Yeah, as I said, the data itself is here the limiting factor for the accuracy. One thing that you can do after you have trained the net is some surgery. In this case, for feature extraction, you want to exploit the internal representation that the net has produced during the training process to, for example, visualize signals in a space that's semantically significant in the space of the data set that you have trained the net on. And in this case, we will just chop off the head of our recurrent network, and we can use that as the feature extractor for a feature space plot. So you can see how different signals that contain different digits are nicely clustered in different parts of this space. And this provides you with very powerful tools to do computations, numeric computations on complex objects like audio objects. And I will skip the next example just because of time, and I will go to the last one that builds on the feature extraction aspect. So many times, if the data that you have available is inadequate to train a network from scratch to solve a problem, one possible solution can be transfer learning. So instead of training the network from scratch, you use another network as a starting point. And the crucial part is that this network that you're starting with was trained on a task that is not the same as the one that your goal is, but is a related task. So the features that were, or the internal representation that was produced while training that network on the different task are still relevant for the task at hand. In this case, I will be using the ESC50 dataset, which holds a bunch of environmental sounds. These are some examples of classes, for example, dogs, roosters, pigs, or soundscapes, or human sounds, or interior sounds, etc., etc. The amount of data is pretty short. It's just 2,000 examples per 50 classes. And you can see how the maximum accuracy that was achieved was about 86%. This is kind of out of date. This is just from 2017. The original paper that presented this data set was released in 2015, and they reached an accuracy of 64%, training a ConvNet from scratch. Now, we have available from the Wolfram Net repository the audio identifier network, which was trained also on a environmental sound recognition task, essentially, on a completely separated dataset. The two datasets do not overlap. So what we can do is extract the feature extractor part of this network, which I am doing here. So here we have a net that from an audio signal produces a sequence of semantically significant feature vectors, and use this as the starting point for our environmental sound classification objective. Instead, there are two options to do this. One would be creating a new network by joining some classification layers onto this feature extraction net, and then specifying the learning rate multipliers option in NetTrain to train only the last layers. But for efficiency reasons, we could easily pre-compute all of the features and then just define a simple classifier, which is done here. You can see it's a simple recurrent layer. Again, we are aggregating the time dimension and then classifying that result. Train the classifier that we just defined on the features, and then fuse the two networks together to get a single result. And just with this very simple net and a training that takes about 1.5 minutes, we get a mean accuracy over that has been, so this is accuracy computed on the various folds of the data set, of 90%. And the joining of the two networks is extremely simple. So these are the two fused networks, and I am doing some ensembling here. And this is a signal that the network has never seen, and it is recognized immediately as a dog. So this is one way of solving a problem, a situation where there is a scarcity of data. And I think with this, I will leave the podium to Markus, who will talk about images. I can do that later, I guess.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, welcome to the second part of the talk. Before I start the talk, first of all, as I said, it's going to be more disruptive. I'm not going to tell you how much so much how things are done or what works, but what doesn't work and what's interesting about it. And up front, maybe just to get your attention, there are two ways of learning. One is to learn or to memorize a book, essentially, or to read books and to get information in and to memorize that. What's the second part of learning, or the second way of learning? Do you know? Well, may I get your attention? The second part, or the second way of learning is sex. Essentially, it's evolution, and if you're successful in reproducing, it means that your brain can't be that bad. You maybe have an advantage, and evolution basically has formed your brain, or rather the architecture of your brain, to do things that you would otherwise not be able to do. For example, there can be a DNA or a deficiency that you can't recognize faces. So it's not just that you learn how to see faces, but there's a kind of a DNA program that evolution has formed that enables you as a social animal to read faces, to recognize them, to see the emotion, and so forth. So definitely the architecture, and that's what I'm going to talk about, so the stuff that is sex-related, that is just as important as just learning the weights, the synapses weights in a neural network. So let's move. What's going on here? Okay, here we go. All right, so this is my table of contents. I'll be talking about 4 different issues. First of all, just to start up on a positive note, I will show you how effective or how great convolutional neural networks are and what they can achieve. Essentially, they are, from a statistical point of view, a very good prior to natural images. Then I'm going to break everything down. I'll show you how to fool neural networks and show the shortcomings. Kind of an interlude, I will talk a bit about anatomy, how the brain does it, and then I will show some, let's say, unorthodox ways to handle image recognition. First, to write an image encoder, pretty much like what we have for audio. And then last but not least, I'll talk about the latest invention by Geoffrey Hinton, one of the grand godfathers of neural networks, what he baptized CAPSNET. All right, so the deep image prior. As I said, in statistics, when you basically tackle a new distribution, then maybe the a priori knowledge that you have about that distribution is called the prior. And it seems to be that convolutional neural nets have a kind of a prior for natural images. And I'd quickly like to explain why that is. If you have a neural network, like a vanilla neural network, Linnet or whatever, that basically applies convolutions and another layer till you basically classify your input, you can just turn that around and also have neural networks that generate images from a kind of a state vector Z. You could do that in a very ineffective way by having fully connected layers. That's what I have basically depicted here on the top. But that is kind of very costly with respect to connections and weights that you would have to learn. So typical convolutional layer would, a fully connected layer is has of the order of millions of weights. Then you can do a bit better by saying, well, usually images, they have the property that only images that are, or parts of the image that are nearby, that they are closely related or correlated, so there's no need to connect the left bottom of your image with the right top of the image. So let's just do the connections in the neighborhood environment, so that would impose kind of a partially connected layer, where you just connect neurons that are within a certain neighborhood. And then comes the next idea of images, and that is an image is usually constructed in a similar fashion on the bottom left as on the top right. So there's no, there you have a kind of a homogeneous construction setup or paradigm that certain areas in an image are not completely treated different than other areas. So that means that whatever you learn for, let's say, the bottom left corner for your image should also be applicable for the top right. So essentially, you can do a convolution. You just learn a kernel, so just a neighborhood of connections, and then translate that across the entire image, and that's essentially what a convolutional net is. And if we were to build now just a convolutional network, but just turn it upside down by not applying convolutions, but what's called deconvolutions, in a way inverse convolutions, you start with a small state vector and then generate an image, then this would be such a network in Mathematica. There's a leaky ReLU. You can also work with a normal rectifying linear unit. And you see here you start with just a state vector of 3 times 3 times 28, 128 parameters, and then you deconvolve it until you spit out at the end an image. So essentially you can see that network just as a function f that depends on lots and lots of parameters, and the parameters are the weights in that network. So it's just essentially when I learn now how to generate an image, it's nothing else but fitting a function. A function, though, that doesn't have 2 or 3 parameters, but in the order of this case of roughly 351,000 parameters. So it's a rather tedious fit. But clearly I can fit any image because an image like this one here, 256 times 256, just has of the order of 248,000 pixel values. That means 3 values per pixel, essentially. So if I now take this bird in, and if I train here that layer, the generation net, then the learning curve would look like this. It goes down nicely, so it does fit. And effectively, if I look at the result, I can look at the result, but I won't do that right now because it's not that important. Right now, we just see that the network can learn the representation of the image. If we do the very same for an image that is now somewhat unnatural in the sense that it has lots of noise, just added Poisson noise to that image, then we see that, again, I can fit that very neural network onto the image. But if you compare the two fits, the two loss plots, you will see that the image with the noise, now at the very bottom, I should bring it up a bit, let's see, that the one with noise fits much less well than the one that was a completely natural image. So apparently convolutional networks or deconvolutional networks have a tendency to go for natural looking images. So in a way they have a prior for natural images, and we can take an advantage of that. Actually, this was a paper by Ulyanov and others who said, well, if that's so, if we have a natural prior for natural images, then we can use it, for example, for denoising. I won't show the code. The code, by the way, and just include, you don't have to read it now, so that you can experiment with this notebook when you download it. So please forgive me for having lots of code in my slides. And what you can do is basically just fit an image, and then if you break off, then usually the image will have fitted the natural looking part of the image and not the noise yet. And this you can use then for denoising an image as one possible application. Or what you could do is, again, I just hide most of the detail here, you can go and do what's called in-painting. So imagine you have an image like this, and I cut part of that image out because I just want to in-paint it. I just run again this network, and it tries to generate a natural-looking image without this artificial cut-out part, which is, by the way, happens to be a vase. And then you run it. Oops, this is the wrong. Sorry. Shoot. It did. Okay, I'm sorry. I ran it again, apparently, and it saved the wrong result. You have a filled-in, an in-painted image, just like in-paint in Mathematica. Sorry, I accidentally ran it again, and I took the wrong step size. Maybe just as a kind of a side remark, this very much depends on the optimization that you use. Sometimes it goes bad, sometimes it goes well. But the point is you can use that prior even to in-paint. All right. Having said that, basically I've said convolutional images or networks, the architecture is really good for images as such. All the different types that you have nowadays optimize not just the way or the capability of capturing images, but just to be better in, to be more easily optimized, for example. So that's another aspect which I won't touch. Now, however, I just recap a little example that I think presented a year or two ago. Just a very quick recap. Neural networks are also easily fooled. And what I'm doing here is the following. I just load one of our first image identify networks, the Inception V1, version 1, trained on the competition data of ImageNet. And if I provide to this network, for example, an image of a cockroach or tiger, I get those identified with fairly high probability or confidence. Cockroach here with 96% confidence, a tiger with 73% confidence. So quickly, schematically, what was done, this CNN, this convolutional neural network, the inception network, is basically depicted by this symbol here. And we essentially train it not just on tiger, so we provide an image tiger and then say the output text should be tiger. We try to optimize that. We try to optimize that for cockroach and lots of other images. That's how this thing is trained. But now, at the end, we'll do something completely different. Now we say, okay, we keep cockroach. We try to optimize the output cockroach. We don't do anything to the network, keep all the weights fixed, but instead we start to train the image. So the image I basically now read in or put in front of the network just as a neural network layer with the weights being the values of the image. And then I say to net train, just train that very first layer. Don't train anything else. So what I would expect now doing so is that I change that tiger down here in such a way that it doesn't give out or it doesn't optimize the output for tiger, but optimizes now the output for cockroach, because that's the loss function that I try to optimize for or to lower. So having said that, this is essentially just dissecting the network, putting in a new loss function, attaching well, actually, I could quickly run this. This doesn't take long. Is running all of this quickly. And so if I train it now, you can see that the loss goes down. The error is almost 100%, and then suddenly it switches, which basically means suddenly it gets the idea, okay, I don't end up with tiger anymore, but I switch over to cockroach as a result, as a classification. So at the end of the day, I just take then the first layer and just read out the first layer of that network. And you see, well, it looks like a tiger. It looks so much like a tiger that you can't imagine that the neural network now reclassifies that as a cockroach. I can quickly demonstrate that here. I put it through so this is tiger 2. I put it into the network, and you see cockroach with 67% probability. If I would have run it even further, I would have gotten almost 99%. So looking at the difference, there's very little difference, and what you see maybe is different is very high, spatial has a very high spatial frequency. So then we can figure out that by blurring it, for example, I get back to tiger. I can also apply a different neural network. It wouldn't be fooled. But the point here is that we see that neural networks are subject to what I would call visual illusion. Optical illusion is a misnomer. It's a visual illusion. Just like humans can go bad. They can be tricked by whatever. But they are tricked by other phenomena than this neural network. So there's clearly a difference between our visual system and what convolutional neural networks do. And that's why I quickly move over to explain a little bit of the anatomy of the human visual system to relate to that in what I'm going to say later. Okay, so basically at the back of the eye, you look or you receive images on your retina. And the retina, roughly speaking, looks essentially like this when it comes to receptive fields. So all the cones and rods, they are basically grouped together to excite a ganglion cell that then would convey that signal onward. And this ganglion cell is connected to all these rods and cones in such a way that you have kind of a receptive field, a sensitivity distribution that is different in size depending on where you are in the retina. So if you're in the fovea, in the center of your visual acuity, then you have very small receptive fields, so you have a high resolution. If you're further out, you basically have large receptive fields resulting in a low resolution image, which basically means that you as a human being, besides moving around constantly, that's a different topic altogether, you look at images not just as the finest possible resolution, but at all kinds of scales, which currently, in many cases, we don't do with our convolutional neural networks. We read in the highest resolution and try to make sense of that. Then once you get that information, it's being transported to the back of your brain via the LGN to your visual cortex. And if you have a look at your visual cortex, it's like the sheet of your brain, your cortex sheet, then you will see that there's an encoding of your stimulus on your retina that roughly mimics the spatial distribution. So if you are get a white light spot on the top right, it ends up on the top bottom here in this visual cortex and vice versa. So you have a spatial encoding, but on top of it, you also take difference between receptive fields. So you detect edges or lines, and thereby orientation. And you also encode orientation in the receptive field, something that we don't do at all in our, or currently in our convolutional networks. This orientation is just one of the many intrinsic parameters that you have in the visual cortex between seeing something on the left eye, the right eye, and so forth. So just pointing out that there's just more than just a location to a stimulus. And furthermore, just as a kind of a reminder that things get really weird, once the information leaves the visual cortex, then you have a kind of a pathway that's called the ventral pathway that basically does what convolutional neural networks do fairly well. It tells you what it is. So that would be that pathway in the brain. And then there's another pathway of information. It's the where pathway, the dorsal pathway, that's basically more processing where something is. So clearly, the neural network of the brain also encodes position in a way that we don't do in convolutional networks either. All right, so having said all that, the first thing I would like to quickly discuss is how would I go about to, for example, mimic the retina? We have seen with the audio samples that there is an audio encoder in our framework, not just one, but several different ones that take the audio signal and convert it to a more digestible format, like a Fourier transformation, essentially, or wavelet transformation. But we don't do anything like that in image processing. I remember in the early days, people said, well, don't mimic or don't fiddle around with any kind of old school image processing features because you're most likely to mess up the data. You're going to lose information, and you'll just let the neural network learn all the features, all the information, all the features in an image. To a certain degree, it's true, but you also have to have lots of data in order to do that. Furthermore, when you train a network, it trains first the top layer, which is close to the classification, and slowly that training descends all the way to the bottom layer that's closest to the data. So that layer gets trained last, and you need lots of data to get good weights down there. So the idea, quite frankly, is why not build an image encoder, pretty much like an audio encoder, and try if we can do okay or even better than anticipated, and in a way unroll a little bit of the development of image processing in the last 8 years. So up front, what I do here, this is just a mathematical gig. I take an image, like, well, imagine you're still an ape living in the jungle. Your retina gets trained, and essentially those radial bases, so the receptive fields, to be ideal from a mathematical standpoint of view, they should be eigenfunctions of all those little patches that you can possibly see in your visual field. And this is basically quickly what I do mathematically here. I partition this image into 16 times 16 little sub-images. Then I generate here a weight function that just decays with the weight to the edges so that I don't have boundary effects doing these small images. So I have kind of it's almost like a Gaussian distribution of weights that I put on this little patch. And then I just essentially find the eigenfunctions, the eigenvectors of these patches. And without having to calculate this, which would take just a few minutes, I would get from such an image this selection of possible receptive fields that would be mathematically optimal to decode your image with in order to process it even further. So the question is, can we do something similar? Yeah. It could be a Grübner basis. You can call it a Gabor wavelets. There are lots of different mathematical entities that very much look alike. So they all claim to be the one. So I'm not going to in that debate, but a perfect point to make. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll just construct my own little weight functions mathematically. And up front, what I have to make sure is that when I transpose or basically shift them along, because I essentially do a convolution with these kernels, I want to make sure that my weight function that I use covers the entire space evenly. And in order to do so, I take here as a weight functions B-splines because they have this nice property to add up to 1 if you just shift them a certain amount And if you add them all together and they overlap, then essentially you get a precise weight of 1 across the whole domain. And for every bin or every pixel or cone that you sample, you would get these kind of weights. And having this weight, I can define a kind of an inner product. And then I do something that you may know from orthogonal polynomials. I have now an inner product. I can just generate now a basis that is orthonormal with respect to this inner product. And if I do so, I essentially get these kind of orthogonal functions under this weight distribution. And I use those to generate now my kernels. And these are just a collection of all those possible distributions you can get. And they look very much like, in this case, Garbo functions, but essentially these are, in a way, derivatives of a Gaussian. And you can combine them if you want to, just pointing out, for example, the second and the third one you can combine and rotate them as a gradient. The fourth, fifth, and sixth you can combine as a kind of ridge detector, line detector, which you can rotate, and so forth. So any linear combination of that basis would be fine as well. And then just go and say, well, what the heck, I'll train now a neural network, first of all, without predefining the first layer. I'll do that, and then I get these kind of kernels in the first layer, so that's what's being learned. It's a little bit, you see certain resemblance, like this is like an edge detector. There should be a blob detector somewhere here, like here. So essentially it does the same, but without having too much data, they don't turn out to be that great. But if I plug now my constructed receptive fields into the first convolution layer by simply saying, take as weights these kernels, don't add a bias, and just do the very same thing. I can train the whole stuff, and it trains nicely, and then I can do the following. I can compare the training plots. Hold on. Here we go. And what you see here is the following. You see the loss plot and the error plot of the training. The blue is the training without the constructed layer, and the red is the one with constructed layer. And it's amazing that because essentially we have the most perfect basis up front, we do better than just learning on data. So maybe in the long run, there will be a kind of an image encoder for images just like this for audio, because you can achieve better results essentially. All right, so that's message number 1. Message number 2, I only have 6 minutes left, which is, yeah.
But essentially for those seed weights,
yeah.
are you locking them or you can modify them?
Those are locked. So it's basically just like an encoder. It's not exactly. It's in a way constructed transfer learning, or transfer construction. You didn't learn. You theoretically constructed these. Okay. Another problem that neural networks have, and which is predominant in the human visual thinking, is the binding that your visual cortex does when it comes to objects that you see. For example, here what do you see? I assume you all see a triangle. Strictly speaking, there's no triangle, but you bind all these wedges together to a triangle, and as soon as I just mess up the alignment slightly, the triangle is gone. You don't bind it anymore. But so that's something a convolutional neural network wouldn't be able to do. And this optical illusion you may all know. Some of you may see an old woman. The more lucky ones, they see a young woman. And if you look closely, you can switch forth and back. So it's a binding problem, what you attribute to what. For example, if you see a young woman, then this is the nose, these are eyelashes, this is the ear. If you see the old woman, this is an eye, but this whole chin is in the nose, and down here the necklace is the mouth. So depending on how you bind things, you see different things. That means when you learn or see something, you not only have an feed-forward network, but you also have some feedback. And that's a little bit what CAPSNET by Geoffrey Hinton, which was introduced 2 years ago, had in mind. The big change is, so far we always assumed that one neuron stands for one feature that you detect, like an edge, a a nose, an eye. So the activation of one neuron in your neural network basically encodes one feature. But when you look at the brain, it looks more like there's a whole column of up to 80 or more neurons in the sheet of your brain that encodes together one feature. So it's not just one neuron, but several neurons. And if there are more than one neuron, you can actually have inner states. And that's why instead of using neurons, the idea is to substitute them in a way by capsules. Capsules basically standing for several neurons. So such a neuron cannot have just one activation, but they have several activations. So essentially, you assign one neuron to one feature. You treat the activities of all the neurons in that capsule as a vector. The norm of the vector, or the length of the vectors, basically stands for the probability of that feature being there. But, and that is new, you have now an orientation of that vector. And that orientation basically can encode intrinsic parameters. Like if you have an edge, intrinsic parameter would be the where and the orientation. If you have an eye, the orientation, the intrinsic parameter may be the scale, how close the eye is to you, what color it has, and so forth. So you can encode internal parameters. Then instead of having a nonlinearity function sigma, a ReLU or whatever, we have a squash function which essentially does this to a vector. It normalizes it to something between 0 and 1 and has a kind of a nonlinear shape. And then last but not least, when you pass a vector activity of one capsule onto the next capsule, you essentially can possibly do a linear transformation T doing so. So just to quickly compare now what the differences are between a capsule network and a neural network. A capsule, the activities are scalar. You have just one value per neuron. For a capsule, you actually have an entire vector. When you pass activities along from one neuron to the next, you just take the scalar value and pass it along. For a capsule, you may have to learn a transformation. Then when you actually attach your activity to the next neuron, next capsule, you do weighting. You do the same for capsules. And then the activation function could be any sigma here, nonlinearity. Here it's a squash function. And again, the output is a vector again. All right, so how does it look like? There's one extra feature, and that is the interesting part about the binding issue, is that in this capsular network, if you have an activation, which is here now, you have a capsule here, one down here, in the lower layer, and then the upper layer, you have another capsule. If the orientation of the vector is the same, once you transport it from here to here, then that connection, the weights here are strengthened. So if the alignment of the properties align, your connection strengthens. If they don't align, no matter how active this thing is, the connection decreases. So there's a slightly different learning. And this is iterated 2 or 3 times. And this is called dynamic routing because it basically enforces this kind of binding issue that I outlined, that you learn about an ear and another ear. And they basically are in a position that fits to a nose or an entire face. Then they bind, otherwise they don't. Okay, why did I tell you all of this last minute? We have the CAPSNET on our repository, so you can fool around with it, and that's what I'd like to entice here in this talk. So this is a CAPSNET model that is trained on, again, MNIST data because it's small and easy to train. Essentially, here you have capsules. First, you have a simple convolution. Then those features go into one capsule to the next capsule layer. And then, essentially, you figure out how long the vectors are in these capsules. These are, by the way, fully connected capsular networks. And then you take the norm, and this gives you the classification. So this is what you optimize. But on top of it, and that's a little bit extra, you have to also learn the internal properties. And for that, you have to attach to the output a network that takes the vectors and then tries to reconstruct the original image with these vectors. So with the properties, you try to reconstruct the original image. And if you're good doing so, you also learn the internal features, the internal intrinsic parameters of that network. So it's a little bit more refined when it comes to training. And well, it has been pre-trained, so I can just run it on a sample of these numbers. So if I have 1, 6, 7, 7, 8, I get the right classification. And on top of it, it gives you the reconstructions of these digits. And it's a nice thing to have. I'll explain a bit more about this. Here's a confidence. You can also cut off the rest and then create, just like with a normal CNN, a feature space. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. This takes a little bit long. I'll just cut it here. So this is a three-dimensional feature space, and you see the nice grouping that I have achieved here. But on top of it, I have this reconstructor, and that means I can take those vectors of those capsules that make up a 1 or 2, and I can change them. So I can extract, first of all, the reconstructor network that has been learned along, and then I can change parts of that intrinsic vector. And you can see that that vector, for example, here for 6, changes that 6 to a different shape. If you change another parameter in that intrinsic parameter vector, the thickness of the 6 changes, for example. Or if you go here, you see that actually the slant changes. So you naturally not only learn objects like a CNN, but you on top of it learn their properties, and that also helps at the end, for example, if you have numbers that are superimposed, and you have to basically make connections, then you have to have these properties, and then you can read here a 9, a 0, and here you can actually read at the end that there is a 9 and a 0 present at the same time. Something that would fail or is more likely to fail, let's put it this way, when you just take a vanilla Linnet approach on MNIST, then in this case it would rather read a 2 and a 0 instead of a 9. All right, so sorry for going slightly over time. I hope I gave you lots of ideas, maybe raised more questions. And the idea of this talk was not so much to teach about mathematical neural networks, but just to basically run ideas beside you so that you have more lust to go for it and to figure out what one can change and what one can study. Thank you.